The Ozarks in 1909 were a place both beautiful and unforgiving. The land stretched with deep woods that seemed endless, rolling hills that looked calm from a distance, but carried a kind of silence that pressed on the chest. Life here was slow, tied to the rhythm of the seasons. Families worked the soil, raised their animals, and held on to traditions that had kept them alive for generations. But beneath that quiet, the isolation bred its own kind of shadows. Secrets were easy to keep when no one asked too many questions and neighbors lived miles apart. Stories traveled through whispers, carried over fences, and at church gatherings, and they were never told in full. People here liked to hold part of the truth back, just enough to keep their families safe, or at least safe from shame. The Warren family lived on the edge of one of those shadowed hollows, a large house that had once been a sign of pride. It was bigger than most, built from sturdy oak beams with wide porches that sagged under the years of storms. From the outside, it looked like a house that had seen better times. The paint was peeling, the windows streaked with dust, and the roof carried scars from past winters. Still, it was the kind of house that made people curious. Travelers passing by would glance at it, wondering about the family who lived inside, but they rarely stopped to look. Something about the place carried a weight, as if the very walls remembered things that others had chosen to forget. T, the heart of the family, was a man who seemed to carry both charm and a coldness that made people uneasy. He was respected in town, someone who dressed better than most and spoke with authority. People listened to him when he talked, even if they disagreed with him, because he had the kind of presence that demanded it. His wife kept to herself, rarely seen outside except at church, where she sat straight, backed and silent beside him. She was pale, with eyes that seemed always fixed on something far away. The children, on the other hand, were full of noise and laughter when they played outside. But even in their laughter, there was a nervous edge, as if joy wasn't something that came easily, but something they were forcing out of themselves out on the surface. The Warrens seemed like many other families in the Ozarks. They had their land, their livestock, their children, and their standing in the community. But people noticed things, even if they didn't say them out loud. The way the wife's hands trembled when she passed the offering plate at church. The way the children looked at their father when he raised his voice. Not with the normal fear of being scolded, but with the deep kind of fear that made their eyes widen and their bodies stiffen. The way neighbors heard shouting late at night when the wind carried voices across the hollow. There were other details too, things small enough to dismiss, but unsettling enough to linger in the back of one's mind. Animals on the Warren farm sometimes went missing, and when asked, the family brushed it off with quick excuses. A worker hired to mend the barn once swore he heard sobbing inside the house, even though no one admitted to it. A peddler who stopped by one autumn swore he saw a figure in an upstairs window staring down at him long after the family had gone to bed. These were the kinds of stories people might laugh off over drinks, but when the laughter faded, they remembered them in silence. Despite these whispers, the Warrens still held a certain power. Money set them apart, though no one knew exactly how much they had. In a community where many families struggled, the Warrens always had more than enough. They donated just enough to the church to keep their reputation clean, and their influence stretched further than most dared to admit. If the man of the house wanted something done, it was done. People avoided crossing him, partly out of respect, but mostly out of fear of what he might do if they did. And yet, for all their standing, there was a loneliness about them. Few people visited their home. Their children were not often allowed to play with others, and when they did, it was only for a short time before they were called back. The wife rarely spoke to neighbors, and when she did, her words felt carefully chosen, like someone weighing each syllable for danger. It was a family both admired and avoided, caught somewhere between respect and suspicion. If you walked past their house at dusk, you might hear music drifting faintly from the parlor. A piano, sometimes played with surprising gentleness, sometimes with a harshness that made the keys sound brittle. Lights flickered behind the curtains, but they were often drawn tight, shutting out the whirl. The house carried with it a sense of being watched, even when no one stood at the windows. There was a tension inside those walls, an energy that seemed to hum in the wood, as if the house itself was bracing for something it could not stop. This was life in the Ozarks in 1909, quiet fields, steady routines, and families who held their stories close. But for the Warrens, the normal life they displayed was a thin cover stretched over something darker. The man's voice ruled the house like a law. The children lived in the shifting space between fear and obedience. The wife carried the weight of silence that had long ago broken something inside her. And the community, though it did not know the full truth, sensed it in small ways, like a storm building miles away, but felt in the stillness of the and one could see, not yet, how the fragile picture of family respect and wealth would soon splinter apart. The Warrens were not simply keeping secrets. They were hiding something that grew larger with each passing season, something that would soon come crashing into the open, staining not just their home, but the land around it. And when it did, the stories whispered at fences and church pews would no longer be rumors. They would become the kind of tale that echoed through the Ozarks for generations, a story too heavy to fade, too haunting to forget. The Warrens' home was a place where tension sat like a heavy fog, thick enough to feel, but never spoken of openly. In those years leading up to the breaking point, cracks that had always been there began to widen. What once looked like discipline from the father now seemed like control that pressed down on everyone. What once looked like quiet obedience from the wife became more like a kind of numb survival. And the children, who had always seemed restless, began to show the strain in ways too clear to ignore. Arguments in the house grew sharper, louder, and more frequent. It was never one thing that set them off. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was the behavior of the children. Sometimes it was nothing at all. Just a look, a word, or a silence that stretched too long. The father's voice, once measured and calm in public, turned harsh at home. He would shout, slam doors, and leave long stretches of silence afterward, a silence more frightening than his anger. His wife, worn thin by years of holding her tongue, sometimes tried to fight back, but her words often trailed off, leaving her shaking while he paced, victorious in his fury. There were moments when the children saw glimpses of something gentler in their mother. She would hum to them at night, stroke their hair, whisper small reassurances that things would get better. But those moments never lasted. Their father's shadow was too long, his rules too rigid. One wrong move, a giggle at the wrong time, a step too slow, a word spoken out of turn, was enough to bring his wrath crashing down. The children learned to watch him closely, to read his moods like a storm on the horizon. They knew when to stay quiet, when to stay out of sight, and when even silence wasn't enough. It was around this time that outside pressures began to creep in more openly. Though the Warrens had land and a reputation of wealth, money was not as steady as it once was. Crops failed one season, livestock fell sick another. A lawsuit over land rights started rumors in town, with whispers that the Warren fortune was not as unshakable as it looked. For a man so proud, so obsessed with appearance, the idea of weakness was unbearable. He grew harsher, more demanding of his family, as though their obedience could shield him from the eyes of neighbors. His wife, already fragile, bore the brunt of his frustrations. His children, caught in the middle, became both his pride and his tools. The mother's silence became a prison of its own. There were times she seemed on the edge of speaking truth she had kept hidden for years, her lips parting as if the words were finally ready to spill. But she always stopped, her eyes darting toward the windows or the children, as if the walls themselves were listening. She carried secrets, things from her own family, from her marriage, and from the house itself, that she never dared to name. These unspoken things festered, poisoning the air around her. It wasn't just fear that held her back. It was the knowledge that if she ever spoke, everything would collapse at once. For the children, life became a confusing mix of loyalty and dread. They loved their father in the way children often love those who hurt them most, clinging to the moments when he showed them approval, when he called them smart or strong. But they also feared him with a depth that kept them awake at night. They loved their mother too, but her silence sometimes felt like betrayal. They saw her flinch, but do nothing. They saw her look away when they needed her most. This tore at them, creating a split between wanting to protect her and resenting her for her weakness. The town around them played its own role. In 1909, appearances mattered. Families were judged on their piety, their manners, and their land. To fall from grace was not just about shame, it was about survival. The Warrens carried a certain weight in the community, but people had started to whisper more openly. Why did the Warren children rarely stay after Sunday school? Why did the wife never visit neighbors on her own? Why did the man always leave town with excuses that never quite made sense? These questions floated in the air, quiet but constant. And though no one dared accuse them outright, the Warrens felt the eyes of the town pressing harder each year. Jealousy and control became threads pulling tighter inside the house. The father's jealousy was not the kind tied to romance, but to authority. He hated the thought of anyone, even his wife or children, having power he did not control. If his wife spoke too freely, he cut her down with sharp words. If the children showed independence, he reminded them they were nothing without him. His wife, though beaten down, began to feel sparks of anger she could no longer swallow. She had given him her youth, her voice, her body, and he had taken it all as if it were owed to him. Her resentment grew, feeding a dangerous bitterness. Old grievances also stirred. There were rumors about his past, about another woman, about debts never spoken of. His wife had once believed those whispers, but over time, she began to see pieces of truth. Letters found and quickly hidden, nights when he disappeared, business dealings that seemed too secretive. Each discovery chipped away at her silence, turning her from a woman too afraid to speak into one who began to dream of escape. But escape in the Ozarks was not simple. Where would she go? How would she feed her children? And worse, what would he do if he ever suspected? The children, especially the eldest, began to change too. The oldest son watched his father closely, copying his tone, testing his authority over his siblings. It was as if cruelty had become a language he was learning by heart. The younger children either shrank into themselves or rebelled in small ways, sneaking laughter when their father wasn't looking, breaking rules in secret just to feel alive. These tiny acts of rebellion carried their own danger, but they were the only proof the children had that they were not completely broken. The house itself seemed to tighten with each passing season. Nights grew louder with arguments. Days grew heavier with silence. Visitors noticed odd things, the sharpness of the father's glare when his wife spoke too long, the way the children froze at the sound of his footsteps. A hired hand once overheard a fight so vicious he swore he would never set foot in the house again. He described the sound of breaking glass, a woman's voice cracking into screams, and the pounding of heavy boots on the floor. The next Sunday, the family sat in church as though nothing had happened, faces calm, clothes neat, the picture of respect. This constant performance, this battle between what was shown and what was hidden, wore on all of them. The father grew more paranoid, convinced that others were watching, judging, waiting for him to fail. His wife grew more hollow, clinging to small private rituals, folding the same set of linens over and over, humming to herself in empty rooms, staring into the woods as if waiting for something to come and take her away. The children carried both the fear and the rage, their young bodies too small to hold so much. Every family in the Ozarks had hardships, but with the Warrens, the hardships were not only from the outside world. They were inside, poisoning the very air they breathed. Each secret, each resentment, each outburst was another thread pulled taut, building toward the moment when something would finally snap. The Warrens had built their life on control, silence, and fear, but none of those could hold forever. The storm inside their house was growing stronger, and it was only a matter of time before it broke through the walls and spilled into the open, leaving behind something that could never be undone. The night it happened, the air was heavy with the kind of stillness that presses down before a storm. The house sat cloaked in darkness, its windows black against the rolling hills, a quiet shape among the trees. Inside, that quiet had already been broken long before the crime. Voices had been rising for hours, echoing down the hallways, spilling from room to room until even the children hid in corners with their hands pressed tight against their ears. The father's rage was louder than ever, his boots striking the wooden floor, his words cutting through the air like blades. The day had been hard. A debt collector had come by earlier, leaving with his hat in hand, but his expression was grim. The visit left the father pacing, his pride wounded, his temper short. By evening, the smallest spark was enough to set him ablaze. A misplaced object, a half-hearted response from his wife, and suddenly the air was filled with shouting. She tried to steady herself, tried to answer him without showing fear, but her voice cracked under the weight of his fury. He accused her of betrayal, of weakness, of dragging his name into the dirt. She stood her ground longer than usual, her face pale, her hands trembling, but her words sharper than they had ever been. Something in her snapped that night, and she answered him with truths she had never dared speak. The children watched from the edges of the room, wide-eyed, frozen. They had seen fights before, but this was different. The air was electric, the kind of tension that makes the skin prickle, the kind that tells you something irreversible is about to happen. The eldest boy stepped forward as if to calm his father, but the look he received sent him back into silence. Their mother's voice rose higher, brittle with years of swallowed anger, and for the first time, the man of the house was not in control. It happened quickly, yet it struck. Head out like slow thunder rolling across the hollow. His hand struck out, open at first, a sharp slap that cracked across her cheek. She staggered but did not fall, her eyes locking on his with a defiance that burned through the tears. She shouted again, louder, and something inside him broke wide open. His fists balled, his face twisted, and his rage spilled into violence that was no longer about control but destruction. The sound of blows filled the house, wood rattling, glass shattering. The children screamed, some running, some frozen in place. The eldest shouted for him to stop, his voice raw, but it was drowned out by the chaos. Her cries echoed through the walls, sharp at first, then weaker, until they broke into silence. Blood stained the floorboards, dark in the dim light, seeping into the cracks as if the house itself was swallowing the moment whole. The father stood over her, chest heaving, hands shaking, not from regret, not yet, but from the raw adrenaline that left his vision blurred and his mind clouded. The room smelled of iron and sweat, the air thick with the sound of the children's sobs. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, broken only by the sound of his breathing. His wife lay still, her body crumpled at an angle that spoke more clearly than words. The children clung to each other, their faces pale, their cries muffled in sleeves. In that silence, something shifted inside the man. The enormity of what he had done crept in, not like a scream, but like a whisper. His chest tightened, his jaw clenched, and for the first time in years, his hands trembled not with rage, but with the faint beginnings of fear. Panic crept in quickly. He barked at the children, ordering them to silence, his voice sharp with desperation. He shouted that no one must ever know, that they were a family, and families protected each other. His words carried both command and pleading, as though he was trying to convince himself as much as them. The eldest boy looked at him with wide eyes, caught between terror and hatred. The younger children hid their faces, too small to understand fully, but old enough to know something terrible had happened that could never be undone. He moved quickly, dragging her body across the floor, leaving streaks on the wood that the children would never forget. He muttered under his breath, curses and fragments of plans, his mind racing between denial and cold calculation. The back door creaked open into the night, and the sound of dragging followed into the dark yard. The children huddled by the window, their breath fogging the glass as they watched their father move through the shadows, carrying the weight of what he had done. The earth outside was damp from an earlier rain, the ground soft enough to take in what he forced upon it. Inside, the children whispered to one another, their voices shaking. Some begged to leave, to run. Others clung to the hope that maybe she would wake, that this wasn't final. The eldest tried to hold them together, his own eyes wet but his voice steady, though every word felt like it could shatter him. He told them to stay quiet, to wait. But in his heart, he knew there would be no going back to the life they had before. When their father returned, his clothes were stained, his hands unsteady. He poured himself a drink with a shaking grip, swallowing it fast, then another, and another. He muttered again about silence, about loyalty, about survival. His words came jagged, half-speeches thrown into the air as if to drown out the reality of what he'd just done. He told the children that no one must ever speak of this night, that to do so would mean the ruin of them all. His eyes burned into them, and though his voice cracked with desperation, the threat was clear. The children nodded, some because they believed, others because fear left them no choice. But in their hearts, the night left scars deeper than words. They carried the image of her lying on the floor, the sound of her last cries, the way the house seemed to hold its breath in those final moments. It was a memory that would live inside them, a truth too heavy for their small bodies, but too sharp ever to be forgotten. The house fell quiet again before dawn, the storm outside finally breaking with soft rain that tapped against the windows. But inside, the true storm had only just begun. The man sat slumped in a chair, eyes hollow, drink in hand, while the children lay awake in their beds, staring at the dark ceilings above them. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside carried the memory of what had been done. The crime had unfolded not in some distant moment of madness, but in the very heart of their home, in the walls that had once held their laughter, in the rooms that had once promised safety. And now those same walls carried a new weight, one that would never be lifted. The crime was not just in the act of violence, but in the silence that followed. The silence forced upon the children, pressed into their bones, shaping the rest of their lives. By morning, the world outside the Warren house went on, as usual. Neighbors rose with the sun, fields waited to be tended, and church bells prepared to ring. But inside the Warren home, nothing would ever be the same. The family had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and though the man tried to cover the blood, bury the evidence, and silence the witnesses, the truth had a way of clinging. It seeped into the wood, into the soil, into the very air of the hollow. And in time, it would find its way out, as all buried things eventually do. The days that followed in the Warren house felt thick, as though time itself had slowed and wrapped the family in a haze that would not lift. The father carried himself with the same stern presence he had always worn, but behind his eyes was a flicker of something new, something restless. He avoided looking too long at the places in the house where blood had once stained the floor, though he had scrubbed them until his hands were raw. He avoided the stares of his children, though he barked orders at them as if nothing had changed. He told himself it was all necessary, that what had happened had been her fault, that she had pushed him too far. He spoke it often enough that, for brief moments, he almost believed it, but the silence that filled the house afterward told another story. It was heavy, pressing down on him, reminding him with every creak of the boards that his home was now less a home and more a tomb. The children were caught in that silence, too. Their eyes seemed older now, shadows etched into them in a way no child's eyes should bear. The eldest son had taken on a role that was far too heavy for his years, whispering reassurances to his siblings, trying to soothe their cries in the night. But even he carried the weight of rage and helplessness. He had seen too much, and every time he looked at his father, the memory of his mother's last breath came flooding back. The younger children were more restless, caught between bursts of fear and confusion. They asked questions he could not answer. Where had she gone? Was she coming back? Why couldn't they talk about her? The answers were silence, or worse, the sharp bark of their father's voice telling them to never speak her name again. Outside the house, the community began to notice her absence. At first, it was quiet curiosity. She had always kept to herself, so her disappearance did not immediately stir suspicion. Neighbors told themselves she was visiting family or was unwell. But weeks passed, and her absence stretched too long. Questions grew. Why had she missed so many church services? Why did the Warren children now walk with their heads down, their laughter gone? Why did the man of the house avoid eye contact when asked about her? He explained it away with clipped words. She was resting, she was unwell, she needed quiet. The explanations were thin, but few dared to press harder. The Warrens still held influence, and no one wanted to be the one to accuse without proof. Still, the whispers began to spread. The father worked harder to control the narrative. He presented himself in town as strong, composed, carrying the weight of a difficult household. He leaned into his role as a man who had sacrificed much for his family, who bore responsibilities others could not understand. To some, it sounded convincing. To others, it was hollow. But he knew that appearances mattered, and so he tightened his grip, both on his children and on his public image. At home, he grew sharper, paranoid that one of the children might slip, might tell. Every sound of footsteps outside, every unexpected knock at the door, sent him into suspicion. He questioned the children constantly, warning them of what would happen if they ever betrayed him. Fear became tea, the air they breathed. For the children, the toll deepened. Nightmares plagued them, waking them in cold sweats with the sound of her cries in their ears. The younger ones sometimes called for her in their sleep, and the eldest would hush them quickly, terrified their father would hear. In the daytime, they played their parts, sitting still, obeying commands, speaking only when spoken to. But inside, they carried a grief too large, and it began to change them. Some grew quiet and withdrawn, others angry and defiant in secret ways. Each child carried their mother's absence differently, but none were untouched. The community's whispers eventually grew louder, especially among the women. They noticed how pale the children looked, how thin, how their eyes darted nervously. They noticed the absence of the woman who had once sat in church pews, silent but steady. Some whispered she had run off, tired of the life she had been forced into. Others believed she had fallen ill and was hidden away. A few, braver or more suspicious, wondered if something darker had happened. But in 1909, in the Ozarks, accusations against a man like Warren were not spoken lightly. Fear and respect kept many mouths closed. Still, the story began to take root. Rumors spread in hushed tones, carried through back doors and over fences. The Warren family, once respected for their land and standing, now carried a shadow. Men avoided speaking of it directly, but women passed knowing glances. Children in the town repeated things they had heard at home, half-truths that stirred curiosity in others. The Warren children felt the weight of those whispers even at school and church, where glances lingered too long and questions came in roundabout ways. They were trapped between their father's threats and the suspicion of the outside world. For the father, the burden grew heavier. His attempts to justify his actions became a cycle. Denial, then hollow self-pity. At night, when the children lay awake listening, they could hear him pacing, muttering to himself, drinking until the glass clattered against the table. Sometimes he cried out, not words but sounds, guttural and broken. He could not silence the image of her lying on the floor, no matter how hard he tried to bury it in drink or anger. Yet even in those moments, he refused to call it guilt. To him, it was weakness, betrayal, her fault for defying him. But the cracks in his armor grew larger, and the children could see the man who had once seemed unshakable unraveling before their eyes. The psychological toll was not confined to the family. The community felt it too, though they did not speak of it openly. There was unease in the air whenever the Warren name came up. The once proud family now carried a shadow that no amount of wealth or reputation could fully erase. The absence of the wife became a symbol, a reminder of the fragility beneath appearances. People felt it in the way the Warrens walked into church, the father's eyes hard, the children's heads bowed. They felt it in the silence that followed when her name was brought up, quickly dismissed with an awkward change of subject. The house itself seemed to carry the weight. Visitors described a heaviness when they stepped inside, as though the walls remembered the violence they had seen. The piano that once played soft music sat silent, collecting dust. The children's laughter, once nervous but present, was gone. Even the animals seemed restless, the dogs barking at nothing, the horses uneasy. The land, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a cage. In time, the whispers in the community would grow too loud to ignore, and questions would turn into suspicions into accusations. But in those early months, the Warrens lived in a fragile balance, trapped in their silence, pretending before the world while breaking apart inside their home. Each day carried the weight of the crime, pressing heavier on their hearts, shaping their futures in ways none of them could yet see. The aftermath was not just about what had been done, but about what it created. A family fractured, a community unsettled, a house filled with silence where once there had been life. The crime lived on in every look, every whispered word, every sleepless night. And though the father tried to bury it beneath control and fear, the truth lingered, waiting, refusing to stay hidden forever. The outcome of the crime leaves no one untouched, and though the courts have passed their judgment, the deeper consequences stretch far beyond prison walls. Some of the individuals directly involved face the harsh weight of legal punishment. The mastermind behind the crime is sentenced to a lengthy prison term, their attempts at control and manipulation now stripped bare in the eyes of the law. Others, perhaps less directly guilty, manage to escape with lighter sentences or plea bargains, but they too cannot walk away unscathed. Their names are tarnished, their reputations destroyed, and their futures permanently altered. What was once a story of ambition, friendship, or family loyalty has ended in isolation and betrayal, leaving every character fractured in one way or another. Even for those not convicted, the weight of guilt, the whispers of society, and the knowledge of what transpired become lifelong punishments on a more personal level. The tragedy tears apart families. Parents who once dreamed of bright futures for their children now face courtrooms, funerals, and public disgrace. Siblings and loved ones are divided between those who stand in denial, refusing to believe the worst, and those who accept the painful truth, their trust forever broken. Former friends cut ties, employers turn away, and the social circles that once provided comfort dissolve in the wake of shame. Survivors struggle to reconcile their identities with the events that have unfolded. One character, previously viewed as a victim of manipulation, now lives with the double burden of survivors' guilt and suspicion from the community, caught in the cruel paradox of being both pitted and condemned. Another, who played a more direct role, remains defiant, unable or unwilling to admit remorse, which only deepens the bitterness around their fate. Each arc closes with a sense of loss, not just of freedom or status, but of humanity itself. The broader societal impact is no less devastating. The case quickly becomes a spectacle, devoured by newspapers, television programs, and social media. Every detail is sensationalized. The crime scene photographs, the testimony, the whispered rumors of hidden affairs or grudges, until the tragedy is no longer just a private story, but a national obsession. Public opinion proves merciless. Families who once held respect in their communities now face harassment, threats, and ostracism. Children are bullied at school for crimes they never committed. Spouses are abandoned, and careers crumble under the weight of association. In some ways, the punishment delivered by the public is harsher than the legal one, for it offers no appeal and no end. Communities once held together by trust and tradition feel the ripple effect. Neighbors who used to greet one another with warmth now glance over fences with suspicion, wondering what secrets might lurk behind closed doors. Schools and workplaces linked to the individuals involved grapple with the stigma of being tied to the scandal. Leaders and institutions face scrutiny for what they missed, for the warning signs they ignored, and for the systems that allowed the situation to spiral so far out of control. In response, discussions begin to emerge about reform. Better safeguards against domestic manipulation, more accessible resources for mental health struggles, and stronger community support structures. The crime becomes a case study, not just in the justice system, but in the broader conversation about how society handles pressure, secrecy, and unchecked emotion. themes of morality and human nature emerge most strongly in the aftermath. The story reveals how fragile the line between good and evil can be, how ordinary people, when faced with jealousy, desperation, or fear, can make choices that unravel everything they once held dear. It forces the uncomfortable question: is evil an inherent trait in some individuals, or is it born from circumstances, pressures, and wounds that were never healed? Each character, in their own way, embodies a fragment of this complexity. Some are consumed by greed or envy, others by fear of exposure or loss, while a few act out of a misguided sense of love or loyalty. Yet all prove how quickly morality can bend and how devastating the consequences can be when it breaks. Power dynamics also play a crucial role in the reflection. The crime exposes how imbalances in relationships, whether emotional, financial, or social, can create dangerous dependencies. One person's control over another, whether through money, manipulation, or intimidation, becomes the seed that grows into tragedy. In institutions, the story raises questions about authority and responsibility. Were the mentors, the leaders, the supposed protectors when the cracks began to show? The imbalance of power is not just a personal failing, but a societal one, exposing blind spots that allowed toxic dynamics to fester unchecked. The question of justice lingers, unresolved even as sentences are handed down. Was true justice served, or did wealth, influence, and circumstance tilt the scales? For some, the guilty receive only a fraction of the punishment they deserve, while others, caught in the periphery of the crime, are punished far beyond their actual role. Justice, in this sense, becomes more than a legal term. It stretches into the emotional realm. Is it just that families must live with the scars of betrayal, that children must bear the shame of crimes committed by their parents, that survivors must carry the invisible sentence of guilt and trauma? The courtroom may close, but the deeper sense of justice remains an open question, unresolved and haunting. As the dust settles, the story reaches a somber resolution. It is not a tale of triumph, but of reflection. The survivors attempt to rebuild, though their lives will never return to what they once were. The community slowly adjusts, though the memory of the crime lingers like a scar that refuses to fade. Institutions implement changes, but it's too late to save those already lost. The narrative leaves behind not just an account of one crime, but a universal lesson about human nature. Love can turn to jealousy, trust can warp into betrayal, and desperation can lead even the most ordinary people down a path of irreversible destruction. The final note is one of quiet contemplation. Justice has been delivered in name, but peace remains elusive. The story ends with an acknowledgement that crime is never only about the act itself. It is about the lives it fractures, the questions it raises, and the shadows it leaves behind. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is that such stories are not confined to one family, one town, or one moment in history. They are warnings, reminders that beneath the surface of every life lies the potential for darkness, waiting only for the right mix of pressure, secrecy, and weakness to emerge.